I don't quite understand why we don't want to have the slides up right now. I mean, just so that JJ just has to push the button and be ready to roll.
Sorry, one sec. I forget, how did you? Okay. Okay. Sorry, what's your question?
Yeah, this is, I just wanted to have it here, so now he just presses the, he's ready to go.
Yeah, so I'm just going to go ahead, it should be live broadcasting now, and I'm just going to go ahead and turn on the audio.
Okay.
And then you can, I don't know if this mic is working. Looks like it's not, so.
Should I ask him to turn it on?
Yeah, I think ask him to turn it on. Yeah, so I'm just going to go ahead and turn on broadcasting now. Oh. Yeah, I think, sorry.
Okay, ready to start?
Yeah.
Okay, let's start. To begin, does anyone have any announcements for the group, such as your company is looking to hire, or you're looking for a job, or anything else that you think would be of interest to the group? Yes, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Brian. I'm a data scientist into Python. Looking for other kind of data science type work. Come grab me after.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm looking for a couple of Python developers. I'm a recruiter, and I'm working with a friend of mine who's looking for a couple of Python developers for his startup company, especially the familiarity of NoSQL databases.
I'm JJ. I work at Twitter, and we're hiring lots of Python people as well as other things like Java, Scala, and so forth. But Python people.
Okay, well, if no one else has an announcement, I first met our speaker tonight here at a meeting a few years back, and was very impressed with the depth and breadth of his knowledge of Python and all things software, and so I'm very happy to have him tonight. Please welcome J.J. Behrens.
Thank you. So this talk is called Best Practices for Software Engineers. I bet you expected it to be something else. No, I'm joking. So there's my blog. I'm Janix at Twitter. Obligatory jokes about working at Twitter and having a Twitter handle. Okay, so let me have some disclaimers and read them carefully. They're important. The views expressed in this talk are my own. They do not necessarily represent those of Twitter engineering as a whole. These are suggestions, not mandates. Your mileage may vary. Finally. I've done this talk like twice, and no one ever laughs at that joke. Okay, so here's the core message of my talk. Be helpful, be pragmatic, be someone other people want to work with. I mean, that's easy, right? Like, everyone could just do that, right? So I'm going to talk about how to make that happen. So I'm going to talk about design and requirements gathering, writing code, testing code, documenting code, code reviews, communication, and then your career. So let's start with design and requirements gathering. And by the way, this talk is much more fun if you stop and ask me questions. It takes about an hour, but with questions, it's like an hour and 15 minutes, and it makes it more fun. So here's one of my favorite sayings. The hard part isn't writing the for loop. The hard part is figuring out which for loop to write. And I think that this goes to the core of what makes software engineering hard. I remember when I was in college, I had this idea that, like, well, I don't understand how to architect big systems, but that's okay, because when I get a real job, you know, there's going to be this really, really senior programmer, and he's going to give me this function name and arguments and stuff, and he's going to say, fill in the blanks. Don't you? I mean, how many of you guys get to work like that, right? None of us. I mean, because the hard part isn't filling in the blanks. It's figuring out, what the heck you're supposed to code. They know that they need some software. They have no idea what kind of software they need, right? That's hard. So think before you code. Figure out what it is, the problem that you need to solve, and then build enough consensus around a particular way of solving it. And generally, you need to do both of these in order. So if you don't figure out which problem it is that you need to solve, you might end up, spending 2 years solving the wrong problem, which sucks. I mean, you'll end up with great software, but it won't actually meet your business needs. And if you don't build enough consensus around a particular way of solving it, what might happen is you'll spend 6 months or a year building a project, and then there's another manager on a different team who doesn't like the way that you solved it, and so tells you to throw away your code and they're going to re-architect it from scratch. That just sucks. And that hasn't happened to me at Twitter, but that's happened to me at multiple other companies, so don't make that mistake. Okay, who here thinks or thought that when they switched to Agile, they could skip doing the designs? I mean, like, you don't have to do requirements documents or design documents anymore. Yeah, just start with the test, right? Like, that's the first thing you're going to do is write a test, and you don't even know what you're building yet, but you start with the test. You do have to do some design. You have to decide things like whether you're building a native application or a web application, Python versus Ruby, MySQL versus NoSQL. You don't have to design every class up front. I mean, if we're being agile, we don't need to do things like that. And so you don't need 600 pages of design documents. But you really shouldn't have 0 pages of design documents either. I find this happy medium, like with 3 pages, where it's like, this is the problem I'm going to solve. This is how I'm going to solve it. This is the language I'm going to use. This is where I'm going to put my data. These are my assumptions. You could get most of that out of the way in about 3 pages, and then you could get to coding. If you don't do that, bad things are going to happen, in my experience at least. Now, some companies have a formal design review process, and that's useful. But you don't have to have a formal design review process just to get some feedback on your design. Getting feedback on your design actually turns out to be really, really important, because if you instead just start coding, then when you get to the code review stage, the person's going to look at your code and he's like, well, I really wish you would have done something else, but it's too late because you already wrote the code, so I could quibble over how you wrote the code, but I can't quibble over what code you wrote. So I think that even with a project where you're going to implement a feature that takes a week to develop, it still makes a lot of sense to talk with other people about it. And this works with, this works whether you're the senior guy talking to the junior guy or the junior guy talking to the senior guy. I mean, obviously, if the junior guy talks to the senior guy, there's going to be some benefits there, but I find that it's helpful even to talk to junior guys and say, hey, does this make sense to you? And oftentimes, they'll come up with ideas that you might not have thought of. At Twitter, we have this saying, seek diverse perspectives, and I find that it's really helpful. When you are doing design reviews and code reviews, remember that they're teachable moments. You're not up there with a hammer and say, no, you're bad, you're bad, you're bad, hitting people down. That is not your job. Your job is to help people get better. You're supposed to be a teacher, not a gatekeeper. So one time I'm doing a design review, and this programmer, he wants to have this, one-page app, all JavaScript, and he's going to use cores to talk to every server, and he's not going to have an actual web server. And I was like, yeah, but what happens if you actually have to talk to a server that doesn't support cores? You're kind of SOL. And so that was one of those teachable moments, which is you can't trust the outside world sometimes. You have to have a basis of strength. And so it wasn't so much that you're bad, you're bad, you're bad. It was just like, in my experience, you can't count on people to implement cores in a timely manner, so you might want to have a backdoor or a way to deal with that. Let's talk about writing code. Any questions so far? Actually, one time an instructor told me that if you wait an uncomfortably long amount of time, like a minute and a half, you are guaranteed to get a question. Steven.
When you said earlier, architect, and your dilemma about architecting is what if you go in and there's a patchwork of stuff, having a big
Okay, so what happens if you're working on an existing code base, and how do you know which battles to fight, which things to leave? You know, that's of course a hard problem, and I think you have to pick your battles. You have to look at the things that are causing the most pain, and certainly if things are working, that's good, but if you have to implement a new feature and something's in your way, well, that's the thing you might need to address first. So. Okay, so what happens when you have to deal with people who are very territorial and code ownership and stuff like that? Yeah, they should watch my talk and not be that way. No, oftentimes this goes back to building consensus and you know, dealing with people in the right way. I also, by the way, I haven't received this question before, but I would recommend this book, Getting More. It's this fantastic book on negotiation. I like it a lot. It's made a huge difference in my life, and I think it would apply a lot to those situations. And it's certainly applied even to my coding life, where I apply these things that I learned in this book, and it makes negotiating with other programmers much easier. So, okay, let's talk about writing code. Here's my other favorite saying: write the right code for today. That means you don't try to solve tomorrow's problem today, because if you try to make the code so flexible that it meets tomorrow's needs, you're going to make it flexible in every way that you don't need it to be flexible, and it'll be inflexible in the one way that you do need it to be flexible. You'll get it wrong, and then you'll have a bunch of code in your way. That's not what you need. Don't leave today's problems for tomorrow. I know that you have a deadline. We all have deadlines. I know that you're going to get that stuff committed if you skip the tests and if you don't worry about the style guide. But you know what? You're going to have a deadline tomorrow as well. And if tomorrow you start with a code base that's kind of crappy and has no tests, you're going to be facing that same deadline or a new deadline, and you're going to have a worse code base to work with. So being agile means optimizing for growing your software as needed. We come in every day. We grow the software as needed. It's still nice software. We go home and we repeat. So. Let's talk about managing a to-do outline, or in more sophisticated vernacular, a plan. Have you ever had the coder's equivalent of writer's block? Okay, so for every person who didn't raise your hand, please talk to me afterwards how you got out of that. Because who here has gotten stuck on writing the first line of code? So some hands. Who's felt kind of burnt out? Good. Who's felt like you didn't have enough brain power to fit the whole problem in your head? Oh, good. So I'm not the only one. Good. So who's ever been so overwhelmed by questions in your head that you couldn't even actually get started? Yeah, okay, so that's happened to a few of you. Managing a to-do outline can really help. It's probably been the #1 best productivity improvement I've had in my entire year. I mean, not year, sorry, entire career. And I've been doing it for like 8 years now. It's super helpful. I'll show you an example of one in a second. But I keep one for every major task that I'm working on. I even kept one for like setting up this talk. I'm constantly rearranging the items in the list. You know, it's a outline, so there's a hierarchy. As I'm coding, I'm like, oh, I need to remember to handle this case, and I need to write a test for this. And how am I going to get started with this? Okay, I'm going to write a test. I'm going to write a model. I'm going to write a template, then a view, and then a model. And then I get that kind of going, and then, oh, I need to handle this case, and then what about this other problem? I write down the problem. I'm constantly rearranging the outline, and I kind of think of it as programming myself. So I am a programmer, and the way that I code is I write outlines. And then I click this thing over, and I suddenly become a compiler that compiles outlines into code. And if you do it in a 2-step pass, it's super helpful. So if I have a question on my head, I treat it as a task in the outline. Getting the questions out of your head and prioritizing them really helps you with writer's block. So a lot of times you're focused on a particular question, and it turns out that that question, once you get it into the to-do outline, is like a low-level thing that you don't even need to worry about for quite a while. And so if you get it out and prioritize it, it'll like just kind of melt away. And sometimes I'll even get through the whole to-do outline and get to the questions, and the questions I don't even need to answer them because they kind of just got answered along the way. I usually manage the to-do outline using a text editor, and I copy the outline into the corresponding ticket, either at the beginning of the process or at the end of the process or at both parts of the process. I don't put it in code because that's not where it belongs. I mean, if you imagine yourself as a famous painter, you don't put an outline of what you're going to paint on the painting, right? You have a separate piece of paper. So here's an example. So it's an outline. It says a bunch of stuff that, if you could see more clearly, would tell you way too much stuff about Twitter. No, I checked it, actually. It's fine. But, it says I'm writing this test. I need to worry about this problem. And then at the end, I'm like, I need to get this reviewed. I need to get this merged. I need to, pull it. I need to deploy it, all that kind of stuff. And I just go done, 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 done. And when I get all the way to the end, I feel confident that I didn't forget anything. Okay. Optimizing for readability. So code is read something like 5 times more often than it's written. So, I think a lot of us have spent a lot of time in our career, becoming straight up Vim fanatics, experts. Like, I could move that cursor like nobody's business, and I could do Vim ninja magic, amazing things with that cursor. And you know what? The point is, the code is actually read more often than it's written, and so I'm not optimizing the wrong thing. So keep that in mind when you write it. The other thing that I find helpful is that I like to imagine there's someone right over my shoulder, and they're looking at my screen, and I'm not allowed to talk to them. I'm only allowed to communicate through code. And sometimes they have a bad attitude. Sometimes they think I'm dumb. And so I have to comment things, and they're like, what the heck are you doing? So I'll rename a variable. And if you just imagine that person over your shoulder, oftentimes your code will look a lot nicer because you're focusing on the thing that actually matters, which is readability. So premature optimization is? Okay, say it again. Premature optimization is? Okay, thank you. Focus on readability and correctness first. Because if you have a code that is really, really, really fast and not readable and not correct, good luck trying to make it correct. But if it's readable and correct, it's much easier to make it fast. And it turns out that about 90% of the time that a program is executing is spent in about 10% of the code. And so if you optimize everything, like I know some people have done, 90% of the time you're wasting your time and probably making the code more complex and not even knowing if it's actually mattering. So what you want to do is you only optimize after you A, find a need, like it's too slow, and then B, profile to find the right spots. Okay, so some of the older people in the audience, who here thought that they knew where your program was slow, but turned out that you were wrong? Okay, so yes, I'm not the only one. This has happened to me every time. I'm always wrong. So when you profile, you'll figure out where the hotspots really are, and then you make changes one step at a time, testing as you go so that you know your steps are actually improving the code. And the secret to speed isn't simply writing tight code in C++. I know that we're throwing distance from Google, but I always like to say, Google isn't so amazing just because they write everything in C++. It's more than that. You go to Google, you type a single letter, and they give you 10 million results. You type another letter, and they give you another 10 million results, and you're like, how did they do that? It's because they wrote it in C++, right? No, I mean, you have 1,000 machines that are working together to give you those answers. Writing it in C++ is great for low latency applications, but you need the 1,000 machines, and that's what's hard. So it's about building an architecture so that multiple things can work on a problem concurrently. Questions? Okay. Refactoring. So refactoring is a process of gradually changing how code is written without changing what the code does. And I'm sure that many of you know this, but some other people in the audience are like, why in the world would you do that? You might do that to make the code cleaner or clearer, or to prepare the code for an upcoming change to it, or to remove redundancy. One of my favorite descriptions of how this works is, I want a feature so that I could kick my kids out of the kitchen, but still see them. And so what I do is I install another door handle in my kitchen. So I have 2 door handles. And then I saw the door in half. and it still works like a door. I kind of refactored it, but then all of a sudden, then I open the door and the top half swings out of the way, and I achieve my feature. I keep the kids out of the kitchen, but I could still see them. That's how it is with refactoring. You could sometimes refactor towards a feature, and then you do the slight change that gives you the feature you want. Here's my advice. Refactor mercilessly. Do not wait till the end of the sprint. Don't wait till the end of the quarter. Do not ask your boss for permission. I never ask my boss for permission.
So there might be a problem here because you take perfectly good working code and then mess with it and screw it up. I mean, refactor it. How do you deal with that?
Oh, yes. So you could take perfectly good code and refactor it and screw it up. I can't fix that. So if you're going to screw it up, like ideally, when you're refactoring, you're taking the code and it's going to behave the same way afterwards, but there's going to be something better. So you're going to reduce duplication, and the tests are going to continue to pass. So I would say that if the tests continue to pass and you reduce duplication, you're probably not screwing it up. So, guessing. Okay, refactoring. Refactoring. By continuously improving the design of code, we make it easier and easier to work with. This is in sharp contrast to what typically happens, little refactoring and a great deal of attention paid to expediently adding new features. If you get into the hygienic habit of refactoring continuously, you'll find that it's easier to extend and maintain code. So there's the nirvana, there's the promise, and I have seen the promise. It is nice when you clean up every day. The code does become nicer, and I look forward to seeing it in the morning after a nice breakfast. Okay, so don't be afraid to rename things to make more sense. So one time I worked at a company, and they had a product that could send email really fast. And so the main class was called the injector. And then they did a business pivot, and they became a company that would receive email and check it for spam and viruses and stuff like that. And the class was still called an injector, even though it should have probably been called listener. And 5 years later, the code still called it injector, even though we hadn't, sent email in a long time. It would have taken like 1 day to update that stuff, or like a week, like not long at all. And that would have saved 5 years worth of new employees saying, "What the hell's an injector?" So take the hit and just rename things. IDEs can really help. So an IDE can look at the scope of a variable and rename just the right instances. And then the right name could really cause or prevent a bug. So if we're in the Python world, there was a case where I had a variable, it was called widgets, and that's a list of widgets, right? Like, it's obviously a list of widgets. And then someone came and they changed it. They changed it into a dictionary, but they didn't rename it widgets. And so I was still looping over widgets as if it was a list, and it turns out you could loop over a dictionary, so that works out just fine. But unfortunately, it's not what you wanted, right? So my code was crashing. If it had been renamed to widgets dict, or something like that, I wouldn't have made that mistake. And so I was like, we have to rename this thing. I've made that mistake like 2 or 3 times. So rename it. This is especially important for dynamic languages because we don't have a compiler to catch every last thing. And then rely on your tests when you're refactoring. Okay, let's go beyond refactoring. Sometimes it's actually necessary to change an API. So an API might be inherently broken. So like the API itself puts you into a situation where you're going to have SQL injection attacks or something like that. There is no other choice. You can't refactor it. You have to break the API. Well, if you are going to break the API, don't be subtle. Spectacular failures are often way easier to fix than the subtle failures. And if you're going to drastically change the type or the behavior of code, considering changing the name too. Just like I said, that should have been widgets dict instead of widgets. Questions?
So what are your thoughts on deprecation?
What are my thoughts on deprecation? I think that's a good idea. Yes, gently. I don't have like super specific practices, but deprecating an API makes a lot of sense. But if it's a security thing, like, you should just break it. You're better off breaking it and sending email. And that way people can update immediately. Follow the style guide. It allows other people to focus on your code instead of focusing on your style. Now, fortunately, we live in a very enlightened world where we don't have these things called curly braces. But in other more primitive languages, there are these things called curly braces. And I don't know if you guys remember this, but you would see somebody's code and they would put curly braces in the wrong place, and you would be like, the only thing you could see is the curly braces. You couldn't actually see the code, right? Like, am I the only one this happened to? So if you follow a style guide, you could see past the curly braces. You could actually see the code, and you think about the code, and your mind will recognize the code a lot faster. So that's helpful, and you don't have to like it. You just have to do it, because we all dislike the style guide in different ways. And so it causes all of us a little bit of pain, but you know what? Just do it, and it'll benefit us in the end. Tools can really help. There are a few tools in the Python world to help you with your style. Your IDE can sometimes help, and in some languages, there's really, really good tools. Like Go has a fantastic code reformatter. And then, of course, I think everyone knows that PEP8 is the style guide for Python. So follow that unless your team or your company has a more specific style guide. Okay, here's the part where you said, what do you think of Google's style guide? Yeah. You remember that show Sex and the City? And you remember the lead actress? She does nothing for me. And I feel the same way about the Google style guide. So, okay, here's the part where everyone throws tomatoes at me. Consider using an IDE. So even though I was previously a Vim fanatic, PyCharm actually really helped me increase my productivity. The static code analysis and automated refactoring really helped me write cleaner code. I mean, these days when I look at code and there's an unused import at the top, I'm like, why is this there? Like, the tool could tell you don't need that anymore, but the person was using Vim. And I still like Vim, but like, the static analysis is super helpful, and being able to just right-click on a variable and say rename, like I do that constantly, and it's super helpful. And if I couldn't use a tool that understood the scope of the variable, then it would take me twice as long, and I probably wouldn't do it. The other thing is code navigation and autocomplete really help you read and write code faster. So you're looking at this function and you're like, I don't know how this works, so you command click on it and instantly you're looking at the source code. Even the source code is buried in a zipped up egg somewhere and you don't even know where it's installed. That's super helpful. And being able to like hit control space and it automatically suggests the method names, that doesn't work every time, but oftentimes that saves you looking up the documentation, which means think of how much time you saved. And then I tend to use Sublime Text when not using PyCharm because it eats up less brain real estate. Okay, so here's my crazy theory. All those times, all those years when I was using Vim and being crazy, crazy, crazy fast, I was using like 30% of my brain power, limited brain power, to edit code, and I was being really, really creative. That meant that 30% of my brain wasn't actually thinking about the problem that I needed to solve. So I have this idea. I can't prove it, but when I'm using Sublime Text or PyCharm, I'm actually going slower, and I don't use the Vim key bindings. I use the slow key bindings. But when I'm going slower, I have a little bit more time and a little bit more brain real estate to think about the problem that I'm actually trying to solve. And I noticed for the last few years that I've been doing this, my productivity has gone way up. So your mileage may vary. Avoid littering. So one type of littering is avoid littering your code with to-dos. What's so bad about to-dos, right? Everyone loves to-dos. Well, the problem is that they're hard to track and they're hard to prioritize. You have a project, you have 30 to-dos. You don't know which one comes first, you don't know how long they've been there, and you don't know if it's a to-do that should block a release because it's going to cause customer data loss, right? If you get them into the issue tracker, you have a hope. You have like a place to comment. You could prioritize them. You could figure out how hard they are. Those are all great things. But if you absolutely must use a to-do, put your username in there so that at least other people could know who to talk to about the to-do, and then better yet, put it in the issue tracker and then have a link to the issue tracker so that they're looking and they're like, oh, this person needs to handle server timeouts, and S. Behrens was the person I need to talk to, and there's an issue, and I could go look at the comments. That's much better than untracked to-dos. The other type of littering is commented out code. I just think it's ugly, and maybe I'm a little bit too OCD, but like I just hate seeing production code with commented out code in it. Like put that code. A lot of times, what I'll do is, if there's a feature that needs to be implemented, I'm not ready for it, I'll just grab that code, shove it into a new ticket, and say implement this feature, and here's some code to get started. That way, it's out of the code base. Or once in a while, I'll put it in a separate branch. That's okay too, but don't leave it in there commented out. That's just ugly. Avoid committing dead code. So sometimes, people, they're trying to make their code ultra flexible, so they have a bunch of classes, but those classes are never ever used, and you're not ever sure that they will be used, or they'll do things like if false to quickly comment out this whole big chunk of code. Don't do that. You don't need to do that. Let's actually have live code with tests that cover it. On the other hand, defensive coding is still okay. So if you have a bunch of if, elif, else, and the else should never ever happen unless Martians are invading us. But if it does happen, you don't want it to fall through. You want like an exception. You could write else raise value error, and maybe your tests don't run that, but at least this error and you won't fall through. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. Okay, handling exceptions. Any questions?
On the previous page, so to help yourself in debugging, sometimes I will write the code that way so that normal production it'll never go through, but when I want to step through it with the debugger and see some special output or do some analysis, then I can get to it. Otherwise, to try to do that by hand in debuggers.
Okay, so he has a workflow in which he has code that doesn't execute in production but makes it easier to debug things. I would say that making your software able to be debugged is a good thing, and I don't have anything more specific to say. So, your mileage may vary. Handling exceptions. Do not catch more than you're prepared to handle. Who here has seen except : pass in code? And who here gets really angry when they see that? What happens is you'll have this code and it swallows all exceptions, and so then an actual exception happens, and so errors happen, and you can't figure it out because it silently swallows it, and there's no log message or anything, and it takes you forever to debug things because it's hard to debug things that are completely quiet, right? You would prefer to have a stack trace than silent failure. So don't do that. Let the global exceptions handler handle the weird exceptions that you didn't expect. You can't catch every exception and do something sensible in a local area, but what you might do is have a global exceptions handler that catches the global exceptions, and then maybe emails you, logs it, and then gives a server gives a user a 500 error and says, we're sorry. That's better than silently failing or something like that. And then in many but not all cases, the framework will give you enough of a global exceptions handler that you don't have to worry about it. I know in Django it automatically emails me, so that's actually very nice. And then of course you have to do the things that make the most sense for your language. In Scala, for instance, there's this thing called options. In Java, they would do anything rather than raise an exception because they're so expensive, whereas in Python we can't even get out of a for loop without raising a stop iteration. So, testing code. Tests can't prove that your code is bug-free. Who here's learned that the painful way? I remember learning how to do heavy testing, and I got 100% test coverage, and I was like, my code is solid, yeah. And then someone tried it, and it crashed. Well, the problem was that the same person who wrote the code wrote the tests, and that person was wrong both times. So that happens, right? So why do we have the tests? Tests are actually there to help you avoid introducing new bugs when you grow the code in the future. That's why we pay this heavy investment in code, because 7 months from now I'm going to have to edit that same code, and I don't want to break today's efforts, or someone new guy is going to come and work on the code, and I don't want him breaking my code. So we invest in tests. Someone once said that testing is the programming world's equivalent of double entry accounting, which kind of makes sense to me. Be sure you make sure that you have the existing tests passed before you check in new code. Write tests for your new code, and then try to keep the code coverage reasonably high. Don't be that coworker who spoils a beautiful project by not writing good tests. Gosh, that's frustrating. There's a case where you have programmer A, and programmer A writes really, really good code and really, really good test coverage, and programmer B goes really, really fast and happens to have a deadline. So what they do is they skip writing the tests, they get the code in, or they write some tests but not a lot of tests. Meanwhile, in the next sprint, programmer A starts working on a new feature, and they ship it to production, and it turns out that there's a bug. Now, that bug should have been caught by programmer B's tests, but there were no tests to catch it, so the bug happened. And so everyone looks at programmer A, and they're like, hey, what's your problem? You take twice as long to code, and you have buggy software, right? And programmers say, it's like, but he didn't write tests. And you're like, save it, buddy, That sucks, so don't be like that. Okay. Testing and refactoring, they go together like peanut butter and jelly. Or, as I would say when I worked at Google, they go together like Googlers and free food. It's really hard to refactor when you don't have a good base of tests. You really need a good base of tests. If you have to sometimes you get into a situation with no tests and you're in charge of adding features and you have to refactor it, so you gradually grow tests, and oh my gosh, that's like digging yourself out of a hole, or pulling yourself up by the boots. It's really hard. Once you do have good tests, take advantage of them. They're there, so refactor with confidence. Rename things, change things around, make big changes. It's fine. So. Do I recommend using the unit test module in Python? I think there are many ways to happiness. When I'm coding Django, they have their stuff built on the unit test module, so I use that. When I'm not using Django, I tend to use unit test. Twitter likes PyTest. All of these things are good. They each have slightly different features and slightly different benefits. I don't think that there's you're not going to die if you pick one over the other. So, yeah.
How about refactoring the tests?
How about refactoring your tests? Well, yeah, that's part of it, right? So actually, I had this major feature change, and there was some library code that I was using that completely got changed, and it completely broke my code. And so both my code and their tests are completely wrong, but by having both of them, I could slowly go through and change it to be what I need. And I'm using the to-do outline the whole time. I'm like, oh, I need to change this function to receive this parameter, and I might as well rename it at the same time. But that's going to break these other things, so I put them on the to-do list. And I keep going down, slowly changing things, both the code and the tests at the same time. And then when I get to the end and everything says done, I run it. And in this case, I was writing it on BART, so I couldn't even for whatever reason, I couldn't run my tests on BART because it actually downloaded stuff. But anyway, I did a bunch of refactoring. I had PyCharm to check my code with static analysis, and then when I finally ran my tests, they passed the first time. So that's why they're there. So.
One thing I would stress is the need to spend as much time reviewing the unit test as you do the code being tested. I can count more times than I care to how often I found that mocks have been introduced that were mocking things that shouldn't have been mocked, and the unit test was testing the mock.
Oh, yes.
So the test was passing, but it wasn't actually testing the...
Okay, so let me see if I can repeat that for people watching. You need to spend as much time reviewing the test as you do the code itself, which I 100% agree, and there's a possibility for your tests to be using heavy mocking and the tests to pass while the code is actually broken. Yes, welcome to Python. Isn't that great? We have no interfaces, we have no compiler to check types, we have to actually run things, and it's perfectly possible to have this code A that mocks out that mocks out code B and code B that mocks out code A, and they both completely pass their tests, but because they misspelled each other, they crash as soon as you put them together. Yes, that sucks. And that's happened to me. Yeah, more than once. Keep an open mind about testing. This is a big one. Testing is almost like a religious thing. People have really, really strong opinions about how testing should be done, you know. So I would say be pragmatic about your own approach to testing, and then be tolerant, like tolerant of other people's approaches to testing. Don't fall into the trap of being overly dogmatic about your approach to testing. So I've been in the Ruby world, they're even more dogmatic about testing. So I've been to interviews where they turned me down because they're like, well, you use Cucumber and RSpec, and we only use RSpec, so yeah, we don't like you. Or I've seen situations where two people are going up for promo, and one person likes monkey patching, and the other person likes dependency injection, and so they won't recommend each other for promo because they both think the other person's wrong, right? Does it have to be that way? I think it doesn't, right? Like, you know, relax. Like, if they're writing tests, that's like good. So, like, let's all relax a little bit. Of course, when you're within a particular project, you know, you try to keep to the style. So if, you know, the project is all dependency injection, use the dependency injection. It won't hurt you. Tell a story with your tests. So it's really frustrating when you have a test failure and it says, foo, 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 bar, 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 1736.39 not equal to 2. And you're like, what the heck is that? So don't use foo and bar in your tests. In fact, make up funny names. So I will say, Alice bought 5 cans of tuna, and Jim bought 2 cans of soda. The total number of cans equals, you know, 7, and I check for that. And use variables and constants for your mysterious numbers, so that at the end of the day, when you have a test failure, you know exactly what went wrong. And it'll be more interesting, too, when you make up funny names. Test your error handling code. So you go into a kitchen, and if you have those, you know, bugs, and you turn on the light, the bugs run and hide, right? Well, bugs in software, they're the same way in that they run away from tests, because tests are like light, and they try to get away from them. They love to hide in error handling code because it's rarely executed. So what oftentimes happens is you have this fancy error handling code, and then for some reason the error happens, and then you go into the error handling code and you find there's a bug in there and it crashes. So now you have 2 bugs. You have the original bug, and then you have the broken error handling code. So you have to test your error handling code. There's just no way around it, especially your global error handling code. On the other hand, we talked about this like fall through before. It might be okay to skip tests for, you know, this situation where you say you have if, elif, else, and the else should never, ever, ever happen. Here, notice I'm using 3 words: else, raise, value error. I don't even have string interpolation. It's probably okay if I don't have test coverage for that. We'll probably live. Documentation. Any questions? Testing's a fun one. No one's going to say that I'm completely wrong. I mean, okay. So there are many types of documentation. Okay, so there's always a few people in every crowd. Who here thinks that you should never, ever, ever comment your code? That comments are bad, and when you see them, you delete them. No one? Occasionally, like there's maybe 5% of, 2% of people say this. And I'll answer that question. There are many types of documentation. There's doc strings, there's comments, there's API docs, there's tutorials, code labs, reference materials. Focus on the forms that make sense for your project. You don't need a tutorial if you're building an internal library and you're the only one going to use it. And then sometimes the simplest, most helpful thing you could do is give your project a README. A lot of people don't do this, and I don't know why. You know, talk about what your project is, how to use it, and how to set up the development environment so you can actually work on it. You know, that is so helpful. So do that. And then document your APIs. You know, when people say, oh, I don't comment your code and comments are evil, that should not apply to APIs. APIs should have doc strings. Unless they're blindingly obvious, they should have documentation. And some people will say, well, you know, I have tests. If they want to see how the API works, they should read their test. No. Tests are not a good substitute for API documentation because oftentimes they're hard to read and have doc strings, Ideally, users of your API should not need to read your code or your tests in order to use your API. Did I piss off anyone? Because I know sometimes people get upset over that. But on the other hand, you shouldn't need to spend a lot of time commenting your implementation. So it's oftentimes unnecessary to document your private methods. If you're 5 levels deep in closures in JavaScript, you probably don't need to document that method. It's not a big deal. But do document the algorithm if it's particularly complex. If you whip out Knut's Art of Computer Programming, Volume 3, page 256, and you're like, this is the right algorithm. This is my guy. And it's like 2 pages of code. Well, put a comment in there that says, for documentation on this, see the Art of Computer Programming, Volume 2, page 256. Or sometimes you'll link to the requirements document. Or if there's an issue and there was a lot of commenting in the issue, I'll link to the issue in the code. That way, they could go look it up, and that's super helpful. Don't be that coworker who updates the code but doesn't update the comments. You have programmer A, they wrote this beautiful code, they documented it. Programmer B needed to hit a deadline, so they changed the code, they didn't even read the comments. Programmer C now reads the code, and the comments don't match the code, and they're like, see, comments are evil. Right? Don't be like that. That's not good. In that case, do you immediately resort to git blame? Yeah, sometimes. More? Okay, code reviews. The purpose of a code review is to fix problems and ship code. If you're not routinely doing both, you're wasting your time. So, there have been times where I'm like, no, this is not good enough, not good enough. And then, they committed it behind my back. Why was I even helpful there? Probably not. Were there other times where they're like, ship it, yes, ship it. They never say anything. Well, why are they even code reviewing it? If they're not improving the code, you could have skipped that. You could have had a robot say ship it. Right? Here's something that younger programmers might not know. Code review your own code. Always code review your own code during the process of committing it. It'll help you avoid committing the wrong things, and it'll help you spot new ways to improve your code. It's amazing how often, I think the code is good, and then when I actually look at the diff, and I'm like, oh, wait, I should change this real quick, and then it's much better. And then I don't use git commit-a unless I've already seen the entire diff, because there is no faster way to get yourself into trouble than to commit things without knowing what you're committing. Grouping your changes into coherent, functioning, reviewable chunks, it's an art form. You have this code reviewer, they have their own job to do, and you're going to dump on them 3,000 lines of code. That's hard, right? So go out of your way to try to make your code reviewer's life easier. And so multiple small reviews are usually easier to handle than one large review. Large refactors should be isolated. So for instance, if you're working on something and you need to change 100 files, but all you have to do is rename a function, do that as a separate code review, because that person could look at 100 changes and they're all the same. They'll get through it in 5 minutes. Whereas if you mix that in with the feature, they're going to spend an hour, right? So chunk them up in just the right way, and especially avoid the last-minute mega reviews. There's nothing more frustrating than, someone's been working on something all quarter, they have 3,000 lines of code, they're right about to deliver it, they need you to give them the ship it, and they give you 1 day to do the code review. And how are you going to do that? Reading 3,000 lines of code in a day is well, I can't do it, certainly. And if I do have comments, which I will, because I do every time, they're not going to be able to fix the code in a day. So, do it more iteratively. That's helpful. Wait. Steven, you moved. You were over there.
So what's your opinion on face-to-face code review versus online versus email?
Oh.
When you have email, you have flags and you don't want to commit the code. You don't want to write the test.
Okay, so how do you deal with face-to-face code reviews versus email versus other things. Having a system for code review is very helpful. So, for instance, if you use GitHub and you do pull requests and you don't integrate the pull request until you go through code review, that's very helpful. I will talk more about the in-person code reviews in just a second. This idea of like you going multiple days without them like reviewing it, I think that that's a bad prioritization, because if you're a programmer and you have two things you need to do, you need to code review something or you need to code something, do the code review first because it's blocking someone. I always give code reviews priority, and I think it helps get things move faster. I kind of think of it as you have baseball and you have the closer who's when you're already ahead of the game and he's really, really good, so he's going to strike the other guys out. Okay, so Python and audience, we're not good for baseball analogies. Okay. Yes. Okay, so you send your change for review. You don't want to write unit tests. I'm not going to help you get out of that situation. Yeah. Yeah, so there's frequent quick make changes, and then there's the negotiation book I talked about earlier is helpful, and then there's another thing that I will get to in the next slide, I think it is. Okay? Anything else? Okay. Am I going too slow? Do I need to speak faster? Okay. Be diligent when merging. If you accidentally overwrite someone else's changes, it is really, really frustrating. And this is yet another reason to code review your own code carefully so you don't accidentally do this. I worked at a company one time back in the CVS days, and for the younger people in the audience, it was like a worse version of Git. And what they would do is they would CVS up on a machine, and then they would FTP it to a Windows machine, edit the code there, FTP it back, and then CVS commit it. But they would share the machine. So oftentimes what would happen is, this guy would be editing code, this other person would CVS up the code, and then this other person would copy the code back, overwriting the changes. Super frustrating, because I'd fix a bug, and then a week later I'd see that bug again, and I'm like, I know I fixed that bug. What happened? And I go look at the code, and my code is missing. How did it end up missing? Super frustrating. Don't do that. Be diligent. Now, when someone reviews your code, leave your ego at the door. Remember, you are not your code. If someone says your code is smelly, that does not mean you're a bad person. And I know this is hard because I have an ego. I think that what was the way to measure egos? It was someone explained this to me earlier. Nano Dijkstra's. I have like a 5 nano Dijkstra ego. So you got to put the ego aside. And then if you have a disagreement, like Stephen was talking about, try to talk about it in person. Do not have an argument over code review comments. It really sucks when you have two people and they're both introverted and they feel at liberty to say whatever they want in code review comments, and so they're flaming each other back and forth. Oh gosh, that just sucks. So don't do that. Like, as soon as I see that there's a massive disconnect between me and the code reviewer, I immediately go over, compliment them on how good they look today, and then try to work through the issue. So now, when someone reviews your code and they flag an issue, you have to either fix it or you have to drop it, and then respond so that they know what you did. Don't silently ignore it. Don't say, yeah, I'm going to fix it, but then not do anything. Be like, even if it's a little bit confrontational, to say, you know what, I disagree with you, and here's my reasoning, and then drop it. That's better than just silently ignoring it, because silently ignoring it is very frustrating. And then avoid committing a ton of change after you've already gone through code review. So if you know there's going to be a big merge, do the merge before the code review so you don't have to deal with it later. Now, when code reviewing your code, strive to have deep, insightful comments. Like, this is super important. Try to think of things they didn't think of, like security, or the N+1 ORM problem, or random things. Like, especially if you've been doing this for a little while, prove your value by coming up with something they didn't think of. Don't go overboard with stylistic comments. We could get machines to do that. And then don't assume that the difficult to understand equations are correct. I worked with a boss, and he did satellite control software, and he said there was this one piece of code, and it was like some physics equations for determining your position, like with the sun and everything, and it was missing a minus sign, and it made it through 3 levels of code review, and I guarantee you the style was like dead perfect. But when they launched the satellite, because the equation was wrong, it started spinning. And it's spinning like crazy, and it wasted half of its fuel before they could finally shut it down. Now, when you're in space, you can't just stop by the closest gas station, right? So it wasted half of its fuel, and that meant it kind of wasted half of its life expectancy. And so they ended up calling it the $3 million minus sign. And the problem was you had 3 levels of code review looking at styles, but no one actually verified the physics equations. So don't be like that. Focus on improving the code. So show the person you value their hard work, and then try to make the code better. Like I said, you're not there with a hammer to hammer people down. You're supposed to help people, grow them, and then talk about the code or the person. Talk about the code or the design, not the person. Never say, I don't say, your code does this. I say, the code has a SQL injection attack right here. Can we fix that? And then focus on return on investment during interviews. And I still haven't fixed that. It's not return on interest, it's return on investment. Don't get hung up on things that don't provide enough return on investment. So for instance, is it really worth holding up a code review to worry about trailing white space or stylistic things that aren't in the style guide? I'm not saying that those things are valueless, but I'm saying, is it really worth it? Does it give you enough value? And I would say that in a lot of cases, no, let's move on. We got other things to worry about. Okay, communication. Argue less. Oh, first of all, any questions? Code reviews, I'm sorry? Code reviews take 2 to tango. Yes. But if one of them brings the music, yes. Yes, so if the other person is really being aggravating, it is up to you to stay calm and not get into the shouting match. Oh yes, so if you're dealing with a person who does not respond to your code reviews, will not listen to your comments, does not respond to feedback, yes, that could be incredibly frustrating, and there's not much advice that I could give to you on how to deal with that, except for when I talk about becoming anti-fragile later. Okay.
So the 2 things I found most of the problem areas, when you don't understand the problem that's being solved, and so you're arguing about the solutions and different problems. And then secondly, a lot of times people don't do things, and then if you ask them what tools they're using, you find out it's like really hard to do that because they're using like a primitive tool. Then it makes a difference that it's a teachable moment to say, have you considered this different tool?
Yes, so the first one is sometimes when you get into a code review, the people are arguing because they're actually trying to solve different problems. And that's when it's really really helpful to talk in person. And the other thing is sometimes people can't give you code that is as polished as you'd like because they're using primitive tools such as a magnetized needle and a hard drive, when really they should switch to Emacs and use Meta-X magnetized needle and hard drive. Yeah, I agree with that. Any others? Okay. Argue less, accomplish more, and don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So I have a buddy, and we fight like an old married couple, and we agree on 85% of everything and fight bitterly over the last 15%. And you know what? It shouldn't be that way. Like, we should both remember that we agree on 85% of things. And so if you have a person who agrees with you mostly, remember, like, be grateful, because it would be much worse if you dealt with a person who didn't care about what you thought, was not going to listen to you at all. So don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Try to communicate your ideas clearly and effectively. That's easy, right? Like, especially when you're typing stuff, right? Like writing an email or creating a ticket or a design or, disagreeing with people. Like, calm down. Try to, go more slowly. I remember I was like on this IETF mailing list, and there was this guy, and I was like, I seriously thought he was like typing things one-handed in the shower like 2 minutes before leaving. Like, come on, you are an English speaker, and that's not even grammatically correct, let alone having any periods, or like he's missing words, and there's no spelling. And it's like, calm down, and like take your time, express them clearly. And then when you do have to debate in order to find the right solution. Do not debate in order to prove that you are right. That is a waste of time. You want to, like, even if both of you turn out to pick a third decision that's actually better than what both of you said, that's much better. And then in general, trust that your coworkers are smart and well-intentioned, unless they tell you that tests are bad, in which case don't trust that they're smart and well-intentioned. And treat each new conflict as a chance to get better at dealing with conflict. So I call this becoming anti-fragile, and no, I didn't make that up. I got that from The Art of Manliness. So, when you exercise a lot, like it breaks down the muscles, and then the muscles get better, bigger. Do that when you're dealing with interpersonal conflicts. Like every single time you look at, well, okay, this happened, and then I lost my cool, and I said this, and okay, well, I'm not going to do that again, and this kind of work. Get better and better and better and better, and especially since you're going to be having the same arguments with the same types of arguments with different people over the course of your career, because, if you're really OCD, you're going to always have to be dealing with people who aren't OCD, and if you are OCD, another guy's OCD, he's going to be OCD about something else, so get used to those same arguments, because you're going to have to deal with a lot of them. So. Okay, so some companies have this idea of formal feedback. It's usually a good idea to share your feedback with people in person ahead of time, and there should rarely be any surprises in formal feedback. They should know what's coming, and use feedback as an opportunity to build people up and help them improve, not tear them down. So there's two ways this could go wrong. One is, this person pissed you off, and so you save it for feedback. You quietly go along, you smile, and then you burn them, right? Like, no, don't do that. The other one is you say, oh, yes, that person's awesome. And the person's like, well, how am I going to improve? You said I'm awesome. Like, well, there's nowhere to go from awesome, right? So if you could suggest a little something, you say, yeah, this person's great. He does this and this and this, but I think it would be even better if you read a book on negotiation. That's helpful. And then accept feedback graciously, not defensively. And I know how hard that is because I'm like the most defensive. Are you guys looking at me because I'm defensive? Like, seriously. People love it when you can incorporate their feedback. So do it any chance you can. Like I love to say, oh, you know what? You're right. I'll do that. That's a great idea. Apologize. Be able to change your mind and apologize when necessary. These are not signs of weakness. These are great signs of character and maturity. Who here has been in an argument, like a technical discussion, and like the other person like listened to carefully, thought about it, and decided to change their mind? It's magical, right? Like, that's amazing. I think that only 30% of people can change their minds, like, let alone change their minds in reaction to like logic and reason. So that's amazing when you could do it as well. And then apologize when necessary. So I worked with Mitch Kapoor, the guy who did Lotus 1, 2, 3. And one time I'm working on a sprint, and I spent all sprint adding features that he wanted to Project A. And then we got into the sprint planning meeting, and he's like, Project B sucks, it's so slow. And I was like, whoa, 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 you didn't tell me to work on Project B. You told me to work on Project A. I'm kind of hurt. You didn't even look at my features. And he apologized to me. And I was like, you know what? I think the world of that man right now, because he apologized. He was nice. He was like, you know what? I'm sorry. You're right. So be able to do that. So, and you know what? In order to practice, I apologize to my wife constantly. Yeah. So let's talk about your career. always be learning, or one day you will be obsolete. You know, I have lots of friends who made lots of money working for big companies, doing jobs that like can now be done with Patch or something like that. Or you know, they were using such and such a technology, and now no one wants that technology. Always be learning. You know, especially if you have a wife and kids to feed, or a husband and kids to feed, or you know, kids to feed and whatever. You don't want to be obsolete. And then some technologies are worth learning even if you don't ever plan on using them at work. Can anyone give me an example? I do plan on using Python at work. Another example. Huh? Is anyone going to say the H word?
Haskell.
Haskell, yes. Very good, Danny. Any others? Go. I might use Go at work, but Lisp would be another one that I would think of. So there's lots of things like Lisp and Haskell that will really, really grow your mind, even if you don't plan on using them at work. That's kind of okay. So grow your mind. Build your network, both inside and outside the company. And this requires more than using LinkedIn and Twitter, even though I think you should use Twitter constantly. Strive to get more from your network than you get from your network. And then if you help someone find a job, they will remember it for life. I constantly try to do this. I've gotten 3 people hired at Google. I mean, at Twitter, I got like 3 people hired at Google. Like, I get people hired at other companies I don't work at. One time I was at a meetup, and there were 2 speakers, and I was like, you know what? You should hire my buddy here. And he did. And now my buddy really likes me because he has a job, right? So do that whenever you can. And then a little bit of back-channel networking is a great way to overcome obstacles. So there was a study back at Bell Labs about who were the best, most successful programmers, and all of these guys are brilliant. They all have PhDs. You know, they all have immensely powerful beards, unlike me. But it turns out that the people who were actually the most talented were the ones that were able to build a good network, and so they could, you know, they could answer questions constantly if they needed to, or if they didn't know something, they knew just the right person to ask those questions of, or if there was a problem, they could just go over and then they're like, hey, I have this problem. You know, how do you feel about, you know, thinking, you know, can we do, you know, you change this, we'll change this, can we get along? And because they already know that person, they've already gone to lunch with that person, you know, it's going to go over much better. And suddenly you have this amazing power. You could make things happen. So get that amazing power. It's awesome. Be friendly, kind, and humble. Honors others more than you honor yourself, because no one likes a person who only cares about his or her own prestige. You know, I've met people like this. You know, they're amazingly talented. They know Python inside and outside, and they're like, why doesn't the world recognize how awesome I am? And the answer is because no one wants to work with them because they're a jerk, right? Don't be like that. You know, think about how awesome Knuth is, right? Or, you know, honor others more than yourself. And then focus on how you could serve others, because to be the greatest, you must be the servant of the least. I love answering questions. You know, people, they're like, hey, how do I deal with this? I'm like, I'd love to help you, you know, any chance I can get. And then help new people get up to speed and feel welcome. So, you know, one of the nicest things you could do is invite the new guy to lunch, like on a daily basis. Say, hey, we go to lunch every single day at this time right here. You could join us anytime you want. And suddenly they don't feel so lonely anymore, and it feels wonderful. And it sucks when you go to a company and no one does that for you. So I always do that. In fact, there was one company where we had to go out to lunch every day, and they called it the JJ bus because so many people would try to come along. But then also remember to guard your time. Like, you know, you have deadlines, and you do have to take some time for yourself to get your own work done. That's important as well. Don't piss anyone off. So life is long and the valley is small, so be nice. You know, it's amazing how small it is, and if you piss off too many people, you're going to end up working with them or not getting a job because they work at the place where you're trying to get a job. And then instead of fighting over who gets the biggest piece of the pie, let's work together to make a bigger pie. You know, that sounds so much better. This is not a zero-sum game. That's not the game that we're playing. We could help each other out and make the world a better place. And I tell this to people at Twitter because if we all work together and the stock price goes up, all of us benefit. But it works outside of Twitter and in the rest of the world as well. Like let's make this world a better place. Okay. And I think that's it. Thanks for listening. And I will take more questions now. Oh, thank you.
So what do you do when you have a horrible manager?
What do you do when you have a horrible manager? You must manage your manager. There's actually this great book called The Career Programmer, Guerrilla Tactics for an Imperfect World. That's actually really, really helpful for learning how to manage your manager. Yeah. So. And the negotiation book, which I've mentioned 4 times, is also really helpful. It's called Getting More. Yeah, you cannot just. I find it helpful to not react directly how you feel, even though my feelings are so amazingly impassioned, but instead react in a way that's going to get you what you want. So.
Does Twitter use Python a lot?
Does Twitter use Python a lot? Yes. So I work in infrastructure and operations, and I code Python full-time. It is amazing how many infrastructure and operations people at Twitter came from Google, and when they came from Google, even though Twitter was already a Ruby on Rails shop in the beginning, they brought Python with them. And so Python kind of dominates infrastructure and operations. The rest of the company is a lot more Scala these days, some Ruby on Rails, some Java. So.
C++?
Some C++. Yeah. C++ is good for certain things, yes.
I'm about to start an internship. What should interns definitely do careers afterwards?
Okay, so you're going to start an internship very soon, and what should you what should you definitely not do to have a good career?
No, what should you avoid doing in order to have a good career?
What should you avoid doing in order to have a good career? You should avoid not seeing the internship because it's very funny. No. I don't know. Like when you're in an internship, you're kind of forced to do what they tell you to do to some degree, and so you have to go along. But on the other hand, oftentimes an internship leads into a full-time job, and if the job is good, that's fantastic. But also, you should meet a lot of contacts because that's the base of your network. And I still know the people from my very first job. That's super helpful. And then, in general, when you go to a new job, you might spend the first 6 months getting up to. Well, you won't have 6 months as an intern, but as a general rule, you might have to spend 6 months getting up to speed with everything you need to learn for that job. Then after that, switch to learning something else that doesn't have to do with your job to set yourself up for another job as necessary.
Don't forget to get a recommendation.
Ooh, do not forget to get a recommendation. That is super helpful. You're going to need those.
I've had interns work for me that even bother acting on or asking for a recommendation.
Definitely get that recommendation. You're going to need it. Any others?
If you could go to the leading universities that computer engineers come from, what would you tell them to do for changes or to reinforce what they teach their students?
Oh, so if I were to go to a university and give them tips, well, there's that great post on Java schools by Joel Spolsky. I thought that was pretty helpful. This talk is helpful. I've spoken at universities before, and I've talked about testing because they generally don't. A lot of schools don't teach testing. They don't teach how to use Git. A lot of them don't. They don't know all the networking things. So I've given talks about networking, and actually, since you asked. One thing that I think that a lot of people don't understand, and I hope you don't mind, I'm going to get teary-eyed for a moment. A lot of people don't understand what's really valuable and really important in life. So I knew a person, and near and dear to some of our hearts. And this person drove a BMW, had a successful company, was making money on his own, had a wife who was a lawyer who was also very, very successful. He was physically fit. And they decided not to have kids because they didn't want to contribute to environmental pollution. And I know another person, myself, who I don't drive a BMW, I drive a Ford Econoline. I have 7 kids. Most of them are very, very loud. You know, I don't have my own company. I don't have $1 million in the bank. My friend committed suicide because he didn't know what was actually valuable in life. The BMW is not valuable in life. You know, being self-sufficient, you know, that's valuable, but it's not the most important thing in life. You know, having these other things where it's like, you know, a loving family and giving back to the community and, you know, feeling at peace with the world, I think that these other things are more important, and I think that's one thing that a lot of college students haven't yet learned is what's actually important in life. So I've given that talk before. I think that's helpful. So.
Do a project outside school?
Oh, I'm sorry. That is a great answer. So one great thing is you have to have a GitHub account and you have to have open source code. You have to show real passion these days. Not only do recruiters find people through GitHub, but oftentimes I've seen big companies that will not bother even interviewing people, like students especially, if they don't have code showing that, you know, they're passionate and that they're able to do things and, you know, able to be self-directed and so forth. Yes, that's a great tip. Okay, I will pass it back over. Thank you very much.
Now it's time for what we call the open access part of our meeting, okay, which is where anyone who has a topic they'd like to talk about with some other members of the audience is welcome to stand up and say what that topic is, and otherwise you can just chat with your neighbors. So does anyone have a topic they'd like to talk about? I have one. I'd like to know if anyone in the audience would like to speak at a future meeting, or if you have know someone that you'd like us to get. That would be good. Okay, so feel free to talk to your neighbors or whatever. Thank you.
Yeah, me too. I see it. Okay. Yeah. There was one guy here you forgot to announce that he was a model.
No, I wanted to make
It's not for the
My name? Peter. I forgot his name once in a while too, Steven. I talked with Louise yesterday because I met her because her Oracle stuff crashed and see my expert on that. Dragging on for 3 or 4 hours. What happened was, no, she's not. She's not. She has a class on Ruby. That's a BI class, and not Oracle, but any she does that for her. So I opted to set it up on a VM because she has a Oracle. No, she does MySQL as well, but she thought it would be better to use Oracle because frankly it's my structure. So, what happened is the virtual machine, the database, not the database, but the file for the disk was this morning crashed. Yeah, I know. Readability.
I'm actually going to get harder to do.
Well, some companies do, but not. I mean, there's some companies. I know. I went to this Corona event. I know. The big ones are too. But so these even for example, I met for a small project.
You know what happens when you don't have software, you have plugin software. Yeah. So we got really frustrated with the files.
Oh,
His test in Excel.
Oh, that's nice.
That's actually if you can get a business people to write acceptance tests, it's something they can work on. It's fantastic. So super painful to do it. Me and my coworker got through it. It was a good lesson for me. Learning you. But you know, given enough time, turn it around. You just have to give them the resources to learn and the time to do it, and maybe turn it around. Well, thank you. Yeah, that's pretty well. Programming in it takes time. A lot of that, that's a lot of what my talk was about. You know, certainly over the whole course of my career, it's been hard and it gets better and better, but like, you know, it's hard. There's no getting around it. You know, Donald Knuth wrote tech over the course of 5 years, and it's like well known as one of the most amazing programs ever, but he did it. So, like working with other people's hard. But then on the other hand, you can only scale on one person so much. You have to work with each other in order to build these bigger systems. And so, you know, we have all of these problems. And, you know, going back all the way to the 70s with the mythical manual, we recognize that this is a hard problem, and we've been trying to figure out better ways to deal with it ever since. Yeah, absolutely. So all programming has to do with managing complexity and managing feature. Yes. Remind me of your name. I will. Joe. So meetups are super helpful. I've never managed to actually hack it on it because I end up talking the whole time. But if you want to get code done, yeah, I find it difficult.
Take what you know and go beyond. What I've learned in courses that
be careful with art. Just keep your fingers open.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Go to meetups and meet people. You know, meet amazing people. Danny? Are you Danny?
That's how you make it.
And then Steve forgetting your name, like in the moment, like Marty. Yeah. So and then like also when you interview people, like often like met people that I kept in touch with permanently because I liked when I was either interviewing them or they were interviewing me. Interviewing is a great way to meet people actually. And then it just
Yeah, I thought the problem of having
But remember all those things I said about the networking, you go and you meet people and say, hey, how can I help you? Remember, you start by focusing on how you can help other people. And then it builds a relationship. And then you go from there. You don't start by saying, hey, I want you to help me. You say, hey, what are the ways that I can help you? And then you grow. Craig, I'm a relatively new programmer. I've just learned Python in like a month or two. Oh, congratulations! I learned about testing. I wonder if you have any resources for general new programmers on how to build my skills, trying to meet up with if I get the opportunity to pair program with someone, I jump at every opportunity. Oh, great. If there are any resources that you can point to me that you think would be really valuable. How do you? What about like watching the Python videos? There's many years worth of Python videos, and some of them like Python tutorials. Why don't you take a quick scan through them and see which ones really appeal to you, and watch them. How do I find the what was that list?
So, if you want to if you Google for computer, then yeah, 602 specialists.
Safe. Yeah, Python is safe. I didn't know about it. I almost repeated your question.
Right. So they now have a specialist code site, and it's kind of just out of data.
I'm trying to avoid hanging at the I would love to find like a mentor that Glenn's been helping me a lot.
No questions much in big things. I'm asking that.
You know the one that seems the most popular for women is Acronym. Yes. Okay.
It's like you get things for being new. So,
it's Ginex JJ. Okay, so maybe if you could send me have no cards. But send me email and I will maybe send it to the women's bench. I don't know if we like sponsor.
We're trying to get that.
Other people not, but I don't. I think this is cool. Women who boldly, but that's oh, okay. Yeah. My background is business, so.
You get all sorts of people on the
I'll see if I can meet.
Beginners, it's
I'm always happy to know anything else like business. I'm always like, okay. I've been distributing myself 500 times. Okay. That's actually everything.
Yeah, fundraising for that.
Oh, Okay. Ours was and that's my favorite one. Fundraising from the So I'm thinking about doing that. I got a couple of process. I'm very optimistic. I didn't go to one, but I'm very excited by them. I mean, one that has hack right, but I don't have one to recommend for that co-ed. I haven't read the attachment. Okay, well then, have you read the reviews? Yeah. Well, I could usually. Okay. Because you do have to, like all things in life, for many years, picture.
Prior to local First, I went to hockey, and I ate my hockey that way, like that. People who graduated from programs and come after.
After watching the show. Is it hack reactor?
It's actually well, not my actually one of the people who they were so hack tools so you also have the price and everything, but go and research. Because you want to make sure you're also
right. Yeah.
graduate. And many of those programs are now starting to have their
yeah, some of them are really good, and some of them like there was this really great post on gaming schools, and the guy gave some really good advice, and he was like, don't go to a school that's going to teach you how to write like a description of the game when you're going to be competing against people who build a full game by themselves, right?
I get that. I did something like that.
I think that there's some value in helping meeting the people and getting immersed full time and people to add certain questions. I mean, in certain cases, I would recommend this one book, getting an introduction to computer science, getting started with Python. I've had many people have good luck with it, but I can also understand why some people want to do it like really immersive and have people to ask questions and also build a network. So because all those schools, all those teachers, you have a basis of strength where sometimes if you're just doing it by yourself, if you're not a programmer, it's very hard. Right. Right, and so Rocket uses Python and for a while, which I very strong opinions about.
Yeah, that's what I'm excited about.
I'm JJ, by the way. Bill Overstreet. Bill Overstreet? Bill Overstreet. Bill Overstreet, nice to meet you.
Because you're 7 kids living in San Francisco?
No, I don't think that's possible. No, we live in Concord, so. On BART, it's not bad. I don't have to commute here anymore. I can commute to downtown San Francisco.
Oh, C++.
Oh! I can tell. Huh? Do we have any? We do have C++ stuff for the. There's this high performance streaming server, so it sits between our API users and internal stuff, and it has to be very low latency. And so we do use C++ there, and if you want to send me your resume, I can try to help you find that job, and so, yeah.
Do they have other sites besides San
San Francisco's headquarters. We have some stuff in like Boston, and London, Portland. No, we don't work from home. So Google and by extension Twitter and Dropbox are kind of they frown on work. Whereas HP and previously Twitter, like you could work from home. It's kind of we have a very, very Google-ish culture because a lot of our people came from Google, and so like you could work from home if you need to like deal with the cable guy on Thursdays. But in general, like, and I think there's some benefit to like hanging out. It's, like the people who had to go from working from home to working in the office, they report some benefit in being able to talk to your coworkers constantly. Yeah, I miss it. I wish I had them. Studies are it. Unequivocally, that is better. It's just, you know, if you're in Twitter and you have a building in San Francisco, there are not enough offices for 1,800 people or whatever it is. So it's just, and in San Francisco, no company I've worked at have decent cubicles in San Francisco. Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate that. So you want? So you have a pen, so I can write down that so that I can write down that you're interested. Okay. Nice to meet you. Oh, taking people away. What is it? Yoga. Yoga. Nice to meet you. You were what? Okay. Yeah. I'll join stuff. Black. I don't know. How do you know they? So I usually So you should probably consider posting your position on the Big Piggy's mailing list. Oh, that's very helpful. It's hard right now, but there's all that. You got it. I'm trying to think of who. Yeah. Oh, jeez. Yeah. I don't know how much they cost, but I guarantee you get a lot of like responses. The fact that we yeah, so the Python have the jobs could be easy. Okay, thank you. Okay, that's a great idea. Yeah. I think they set it up. They're trying to do the thing where the code runs under both. And so, like, you can run your code under 3, but like all the infrastructure, like the continuous integration, is all set up so that there's a happy path that we use 2.6 right now. And when I tried to go off the happy path just to use Python 2.7, that was great pain. I just gave up. Hopefully, we'll upgrade it to 2.7. We'll jump to 3.4. Well, the fact that like I'm working on my code and it works, but as soon as I try to put it in continuous integration, the continuous integration was running under 2.6 because it had no idea how to run half the mono repo under 2.6 and half of it 2.7. stuff like that. And you know, there's if there's eggs, you know, that might be like things are working for 6, but maybe not working. So this happened with Ligiano. So okay. Oh, that's a great question. So at the base level, I would use unit tests using Jasmine, and then higher up, I would use WebDriver with Sauce Labs. No, we have our own internal stuff. We're big enough to use that in-house. You know, there's a bunch of ones that do various things. Sauce Labs, I think, is the biggest one. Most polished, probably, but I could be wrong. But that's probably what polished. Just like they'll run your tests on all the browsers you care about and have a video of it running so that if it fails, you can look at the video and see what happens. That's all. You know, it depends on your project. I mean, I work on an internal tool, so everyone uses Chrome, right? So, but if you're building Twitter.com, I'm sure those guys, you know, have to, they know exactly what browsers they're targeting. They probably do have tests that run. I know they have WebDriver probably test all the You know, it's a matter of diminishing returns now, I guess. I'm not on that team, but I'm sure that they probably picked out a reasonable pragmatic set of browsers that they were going to test. So.
Yeah. I mean, if you're using this browser, you better check it on, you know, this device.
Well, you know, it's a lot more straightforward these days because there's IE on Windows. There's no longer any IE on Mac. There's Safari on Mac, and you just ignore it on Windows. It doesn't really matter. And then Chrome is going to be pretty stable among the 3 browsers. I mean, among the 3 operating systems. So that's, you know, that's 90% of your work right there.
You don't see that sometimes. See you.
No, I think Firefox is probably fine. And how are you just testing it on. I don't think that there's going to be in the old days, there were big differences between IE on Windows and Mac because the code base was completely different. But these days, the code bases are relatively solid among the different operating systems. That's my guess.
It also depends how fast you want to get it to market. If you want to beta test it before you beta test it, and you say, disclaimer, we're still working on new versions. You get it out there and get feedback faster. Spend a lot of time just trying to get browser compatibility, only to find out that that's really not what everybody wanted anyway. So you have to.
Oh, and then my favorite is like, you know, people who have IE6 probably are not going to pay for your product anyway. So
yeah,
why bother? I didn't like what they did to what's his name, Brendan Wright.
If you use an old browser on Yahoo,
really?
And then it will even, like, parts of Yahoo Mail won't work, you know, there's no send button if you use a browser. You can't sign out. I mean, it's like a disaster.
Wow. Did not know that. I thought they were doing this progressive enhancement thing. Like, they talked a lot about progressive enhancement. You start with the lowest level and gradually add things to it so that it always works.
It's like it's a mail system with no send button. You know, and then they enhance it with a send button. It's really gotten to the point where, I mean, it used to have a send button, but it doesn't.
Silly.
Did you claim that you were
No, someone told it to me like while I was eating dinner, and so I was like, okay, I got to work that into the talk. Yeah. Actually, I had another joke that I was dying to tell, but I didn't know if it might go over well. Do you know why Canadians are so sexy? He has really big books. Does it? Yeah, twice. I do. Well, wow, that sounds. I would be unhappy too. Well, Computer History Museum. What was it? Revolutionaries.
Later. They're trying to explain it to you, but you don't I don't get it.
I'm okay. I have it on my desk. My buddy bought the volume for me, and it just sits on my desk. Now, I'm not smart enough to actually understand it, but all four. There's it's like 4A. And it's not even like it's not even complete. It's like 4A. You know, it's just so funny that how different my idea of software engineering is from what he was doing. I would say that what he was doing was computer science and algorithmic analysis, whereas so much of what I have to do with software engineering is people skills, right? Like dealing with people in code reviews and testing and like mundane stuff, you know. Yeah, but I mean, these days, when someone was saying that, especially like web programmers, I mean, to a certain degree, I've done a lot of web programming over the course of my career, and at a certain level, plumbers, or just plumbers for information. Like these days, I've been doing supply chain management algorithms, which are very, very exciting. But most of the time, I'm just getting the data from point A to point B. It's not actually that sophisticated. Oh wow, not Java, huh? No, because it might not be fast enough if it was assembly originally. Yeah. It's been like, yeah, Doc. And it's been like that for like, what, 1 or 2 decades? At least. It's been a while. Maybe not in C++, but in C, it's been a while for a long time. It's been the case for a long time that C could spit out better assembly than you could write by hand because it could optimize things that you could fit into earlier.
Well, sometimes that's better to start out that before because so many people start out with high-level languages, and then without really understanding what's going on.
No, I would argue that there's really a value in starting kids off with something that they could fall in love with, and then deal with the harder core subjects when they're ready for it and they're already hooked.
Yeah.
There's that side to it too. Yeah. Well, it depends on the college, of course.
And it really depends on the personality, because there's some kids that love to just dig in and when they
But Mark is really awful.
Marcus is.
This is the MIT robotics stuff.
No, I mean, so Buffalo is like cheaper. So
that's because I heard that and Buffalo is like really good software, and
And so one will be like that. It's more of an standard software. So there's no machine structure, no welding, you don't do that. You just give them standard care, and standard challenge every year. It's pretty cool. But I do myself just
My coworker.
it's in the school term, usually in November. And then they have one for the adults.
Why is that interesting?
Besides the elementary,
I did the shipper first. I don't want to do it anymore.
Okay.
So I just have to put it plastic there. No. I don't mean there's not a single word like that. There are these machines that do where that.
They're what used to be called robots.
They used to be called robots.
There's a strong demand for C++ programming.
What do you call them then?
They're no smarter than
I worked there for 2 years. I loved it.
And the problem is getting the whole
Like I knew an intern who did that, but
they're stupid as and I can't write the
no, it's these days it's not like that. They recognize that there's so much value in attracting the good talent by telling them what they're going to work on. That like more and more you could have. I actually had a say. Like I turned down the first group, and then anyway turned down 2 groups, and finally agreed on the group that I went to. And I wanted to do developer relations, and I did it for YouTube API, which was much more interesting than doing the ads API, which was all SOAP based. So, and there's it's actually a nice place in that there's lots of older programmers, lots of good C++ people. It's not like everyone's fresh out of college. So.
And we buy our motors
No, but when you're looking, is what I'm saying. Don't. If you're, I would always say, anytime you're happy at a job, don't leave it. I only leave a job when I'm miserable. But like, if you go looking, you might find a nice place in Google, and I can introduce you.
You say that, but you're saying good things about Google while you're working.
I worked at Google for 2 years, and then I've been at Twitter for 1 year.
I know, but you said don't leave it if you like it. And you were saying it was great
Well,
working
I
at
was
Google.
not enjoying my manager whatsoever, and then I was commuting 120 miles a day.
There you go.
So,
That's it. Oh, yeah.
Later, they
yeah, well, you know, if that's what you take home, like, despite the suicide story and everything else.
Well, so now it's a pretty so that you get
They can have half children, only have 2. The population will go down so fast.
Yeah. And especially if you're intelligent and educated, like, you know, think of what a loss we had with the fact that Newton never had any kids, right? Like,
I mean, listening to everybody's ideas is like a tremendous multiplier.
Well, of course it's conjecture, but it's still a loss. Huh?
Yeah, not really going to be repetitive.
I remember him saying something about, like, if I was going to get my mind off of it. Huh?
Oh, thank you.
What? Isaac Newton?
Yeah, Newton.
I know. Isaac Newton doesn't have any aphorisms of that
it's mainly because I'm not used to this.
Talk about this.
Yeah, so we don't.
No, I remember reading a quote from, like, one of his letters, or his diary or something like that, where it was saying, but, like, there's no kids from that guy, right? What a shame.
Oh man, well, today I got in.
It wasn't.
Today I got in. Yeah, so
Oh, you know, I don't know.
got the whole genealogy map.
No, he had to order all the ways.
Ooh, that's good.
But did Einstein have one kid? That's But actually, my joke is that I actually had 10 kids, but unfortunately he was counting in binary.
I was waiting. What was the truth?
Wow. You're getting.
Oh, because there's a bunch of disclaimers, and the last disclaimer was people who read disclaimers tend to lead longer, more fulfilling lives. And so you have to wait for them to actually read it. Whereas most people don't, you know, they just skip over it. So.
The rest of it, powertrain, whatever else, there's like other people.
What's your name?
Specifically.
So Bill, do you know, like my buddy Mike Japonis over there?
Awesome.
Because he's like, I'm Brian. I'm sorry, Japonis in the jet over there. Because he's like,
So what you were just referring to about this
guy, Computer History Museum person. He said, Mike Japonis.
You're Python too.
Yeah.
No, I actually recently graduated.
Okay.
Where'd you go to school? Mr. Davis.
Okay.
You can check in anything. Not far.
We check in tests with, we check in code without unit tests.
Okay.
And you cannot, yeah,
That's not what you're doing now.
Not doing security right
Well,
like when I apply whatever I learned, yeah, but no.
No, but the book teaches you how to deal with bad scenes.
Security
There's the other book, which was the Group Programmer, Electronics for an Imperfect World. Still a full book about like dealing
I
with
love
situations.
the guys digging in, but then you get to a certain point where it's like, oh, the creativity is over in the application.
I'm not able to do this because
I mean, you can build stuff so much faster in the application world.
Yeah, and you interact with a lot
I am
more
going
people.
Instead of embedded systems or something.
I have a job. I know, but you're a party dude. You know, like this old guy who kind of
Yeah, but like I said,
I helped out your daughter as well as I
joined the company.
she's really excited. She's
Oh, okay.
I'm really young.
I wonder, I don't know.
I wonder. I had no idea. It's
Before
just
last
really
year.
like-
It wasn't Bill or Ted.
Oh yes, hi.
I was in intern.
So you did Python before then?
Yeah, and I actually did Python before actually being an intern and so on.
Oh,
But
okay.
it,
Go online and you can see this. Wow, that's really cool. It's really cool.
not
And
much.
But you do, like, you have
My own
open
stuff,
source.
and I liked it. I actually started as a web programmer and then switched to
They
Python.
said
And
that I was inspiration for that. I like it. Nice. Called inspiration.
Remember that?
So my name is
5
Don Lonnie.
years ago, I was doing PHP.
Oh, yeah.
Right now, web apps in PHP.
And you're a security guy.
I'm like,
Yeah.
What was I doing? You know?
Well, I actually, there was a time I
So, but I did help with that. So yeah,
I started with Perl.
Okay.
I was coding Perl and then I switched to, well, of course, besides like C++, Java and all that stuff. But for like server based, I was more like,
it could be announced.
Yeah.
and then switched to
Well, that's
PHP
why
and
we
then,
did the restoration.
the rest.
When it gets Facebook was
Yeah.
the first sort of serious.
But being having your master's in security and being a PHP guy is like that's
Oh, no, I was exactly, I actually,
You're working
I
on
quit
machines.
using PHP before
Oh, okay.
starting my master's
Okay,
program.
there you go. There you go.
And then after finishing the master's, I was like,
What was I doing?
Yeah.
It's better.
I know, it's good to have both. My bachelor's is in computer science also, so I came with that background, and I was like, okay, I want to learn more about
my wife.
Yeah, it's a good thing.
No, actually I did security, but my thesis was on computer genetics and social networks.
So
Oh, okay.
So I at the end of my program, I switched, and my research actually was in
What is a computer-generated language in social networks? So try to figure out what that means.
Oh yeah, so you have almost a joke. So you have
so much time, well, but only 2/3 of it, you know, the first 2/3.
Natural language processing and natural
Oh,
language
okay.
generation. So I use natural language processing, but I design a few algorithms to understand conversation.
9 days.
Okay.
I noticed.
And
I'm
then
impressed. Anyway, it's a nice place, and we write everything in.
at the end, the whole thing
sort of amazing. And I wonder
goes to like some business called intelligence.
C is a hard work control
Big algorithm, and it spits out these automatic replies to quiz or to health updates or to diagnose based on the conversation that two or more users
Automatically
it can yes, or if the user generated replies. So, for example, based on the study of the conversation between two or more users, it learns and then it applies that algorithm to reply to that user. Or
so
if
it's
you,
basically taking
we operate.
existing knowledge base and trying to compile an answer from other answers.
also, when I started doing this, I was using a new version of social network that I built for this, which was not living on top of Facebook, on top of Twitter, or anything else. And it had some extra
He's not actually that hard to deal with.
like I was using modified
And there's a style guide, and we did that. It was fun.
track. It was kind of like it was research based, so of course the privacy aspect was not really a concern. It was a research project. But yeah, it was basically tracking the activity and the location of a user or more than inside the company. So you would basically trigger these sensors. While triggering those sensors, you would do like certain activities or like update your status message or update your Twitter. And then all that data would be interpreted and
No, I very much
like,
because what happens is that
go each day or how your pet.
and they won't give you a shipment because
part of the
they're
data
very
would be used eventually because part of the research project was sponsored by the Energy Commission. So it was something like how to use social networks to better find ways to efficiently save energy.
It's like nobody knows it's going to save
office
you.
buildings and whatever.
Oh yeah,
So they would basically
no, they would never know.
it's a very big stretch, and I was doing it because I was getting funding for that. That's why I switched, and then I eventually turned it into like a natural language processing.
So I do have questions on your natural language processing because I've been looking for a tool to do this. And so do you know what Hubble is? Yeah.
Okay, so I can answer this question.
So what they do is they do this for universities. I think they're well, I know they're based out of Ireland, but they just set up here in Silicon Valley. And what they do is for the university networks and stuff, for like admissions and stuff, they see what you're talking about. Supposedly, that's what they say they do. Now they go and they build like a database instead of having like frequently asked questions. It's where somebody asks a question and then somebody who's a subject matter expert answers the question, and it learns from that. And then the next person asks a question and it says, "Is this what you're looking for?" based on taking those responses. But they don't understand natural language processing at because I brought them in and I talked to them and I said, "You guys have an awesome idea and an awesome product, but you're missing so many. Every time you try to build a knowledge base, it's not even really coming close to hitting the right answers. And I can even write." I can use Elasticsearch or something, or write something better than you guys are doing with the natural language. Now, if you could get the students actually doing something that was intelligent, this would be an awesome tool because the user interface is beautiful, and the way it does it, the way it starts, auto displaying the answers. Is this what you're looking for? It just really blows well done.
Yeah, but
Intelligence is horrible. It's just all it's doing is keyword searches. It's not even doing a good job. It's doing simple things like stemming stop words, which are just like the ultra basics. That's not even really natural language processing.
I don't know. I don't know exactly what they were using.
What I'm asking is, so do you know of a tool if it's open source, because I think Oracle has one, but it's out of their price range. You know, but something that's really good at doing, like, where we could build up frequent answer questions. So think about, like, in the court system where they get 100,000 questions, and you answer, and as the clerks answer, we start building a knowledge base. Of course, it goes into a queue so that we don't publish something that we don't want to publish, but it says here, I'm going to compile these answers, and here's what possible answer. It's actually but I don't know if there's a product that does that yet. Or maybe you guys have one in Twitter.
No, I don't. I'm not sure.
Well, one of my mentors.
Oh, he's too kind. It's the other way around.
Too true.
Okay, keep it short. So, for my research, I built my own.
Chatting with you. I still do.
I was using a really example that was used for analysis just to understand, at least get an idea of what the sentiment of the message was. But I actually built my own tool using like.
Well, it does sentiment, but that's not the same as building a response.
No. That's part of the data that I was analyzing. Okay. So I understand better the content of the message that was being, going back and forth the conversation. But the way of actually coming up with an answer was a bit primitive because most of the product I was using was but at the same time, I didn't use any outside product for actually generating language. I did my own structure of like decision trees, and based on what I was analyzing,
so can I.
Different options for the user to reply back. You could do that like that, create a ranking system on those replies, and then based on the most ranked reply, automatically reply with that. But I wasn't doing that. I was basically providing the user with, if your ex-friend sent you this message, and based on your conversation, this is what you should probably think of replying, or create your own reply. So it was generating content, but I didn't go all the way to say, okay, this is the message that
but I'm not even,
I should be replying.
But yeah, I'm not even looking for an exact message, even if it could populate and give them something that's close, and then they don't have to type the whole thing in and say, this is what, even if it goes into a queue and there's no current answer, it goes in and the clerks answer it and say, here's the response, and then it goes in, and then the next time it goes back, it says, I think it's this, but we don't want to publish it.
5 years or something like that?
So this gives suggestions.
Yeah.
My stuff was giving suggestions. It was like 5 suggestions of what you could actually reply back to a friend.
And so how did it match? What did you use NTLK?
I was doing a keyword analysis. And then I was building this. So I had like different buckets on like what kind of keywords, what kind of keywords matches what kind of themes that the conversation was about. Like I don't know, a football game, or and then based on that, I could.
So did you do like frequency analysis of these words?
Yes, and then matching them with this. Hash maps with dictionaries of keys and
but how did you relate them together? So ordering phrases, match phrases.
So phrases. So you had like 2 or more words in the same order, and then match that with something that you already have stored or learned from different conversations.
And you wrote that from scratch. Yeah. You didn't use something like Lucene or something that's out there that does that stuff.
Okay. No, I was working with my advisor. We just started drawing them. They was Python form, and then I built everything in Python, and just like okay, so this we just iterated on it several times, created a model. Again, like I said, it was very primitive. It's not a product, and I can. It's not going to
Well, I think there's a market.
It will be, but it's years of research. And I had the option to continue with the PhD or go into the industry, and I was like, I want to go into industry for 2 years and then start PhD.
Yeah. So what open source are you working on?
I'm mostly working with the company.
Yeah, once you've been programming all day, it's like, it's like
not only just. Plus, I'm still doing a bit of research at the university.
Oh, okay.
roles like having 2 jobs.
Yeah, like especially
full time and part. There is no more time. That
Oh yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's good.
Nice talking to you.
Yeah.
And see you next time.
Yeah. I was like the beta should I need.
No, exactly. That's exactly what I was thinking with JJ. I was like, okay, I'm gonna follow you. Taking a presentation. I wanna see how you do it. So it's fun. Just get ready.
As much as I can push people to meet this guy right test.
So,
Oh yeah.
you know this book called The Psychology of Computer Programming by a guy named Jerry Weinberg, Daryl Weinberg? It's an old concept, but Danny was talking about
He's like 12 years ago, he was gone.
no one person entrepreneurship, or they all were. In other words, it wasn't a ego issue.
I didn't know what Python is.
He called this programming and represents, I think, the best way to do it. I look at it differently.
Right? Like, it's fine. If you enjoy one, then come. I miss Reg.
What I noticed was that
But you know, look, I did Ruby for how many years? I did Dart.
we're all point of view, but this instantly, people understand where you're coming from, and they begin to adopt your point of view. So what that means, in my opinion,
You want to go to the Thai house?
if you have these programs trying to go to Thai, that means that you yourself have taken this program to change it to what it means to
Are you
be
going to go?
strong.
Okay, cool. Let's do
And
it.
if you can't, you leave.
Mike's not coming, which is a shame.
No, I'm going to.
Mike is. Hey Mike.
I am Mike. Hi.
Hi. Hold on.